In the spring of 1940, as Europe burned and America watched from across the ocean, the US Army issued a procurement request that would change the course of modern warfare. They needed a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, something fast, durable, and simple enough to be mass-produced in months. What they received were proposals from established manufacturers, each one heavier, more complex, and more expensive than the specifications allowed, except for one. A blueprint arrived at the Quartermaster Corps office in Philadelphia, marked with a handwritten note, rejected by internal review, too unconventional. The engineer's name was Karl Probst. He had 72 hours to prove that his radical design could work. The vehicle he imagined would be called the Jeep, and it would carry more soldiers, cross more rivers, and survive more battles than any other machine in the Second World War. But in that summer of 1940, no one believed him. Probst was not a celebrated name in Detroit. He had spent 15 years working in the shadows of larger men, chief engineers who took credit, executives who dismissed his sketches as impractical. He had designed suspension systems, calculated load distribution, and refined transmissions for trucks that were never built. His colleagues called him meticulous. His superiors called him stubborn. When the Army's specifications landed on the desks of Willys Overland Motors, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. They had no time, no budget, and no faith in experimental ideas. Probst's proposal, a vehicle with a flat body, four-wheel drive, and a frame so light it seemed fragile, was dismissed within hours. The chief engineer told him it would never hold up under combat conditions. Probst disagreed. He took his blueprint home, reworked the calculations through the night, and submitted it directly to the Army the next morning. It was an act of defiance that could have ended his career. Instead, it saved an entire company and an entire war effort. The Army's requirements were brutal. The vehicle had to weigh less than 2,300 pounds, seat 3 men, carry a machine gun, and be delivered in prototype form within 49 days. Most manufacturers called it impossible. Bantam Car Company, a small operation in Pennsylvania, took the contract, but they had no chief engineer. They called Probst. He arrived in Butler, Pennsylvania, on a humid July morning with nothing but his rejected blueprint and a steel ruler. The factory floor was chaos. Welders worked without plans. Mechanics assembled parts that didn't fit. The company president, Francis Fenn, looked at Probst and said, "We have 5 weeks. Can you do this?" Probst didn't answer. He walked to the drafting table, laid out his design, and began to sketch. For 18 hours a day, he refined every joint, every angle, every weld. He eliminated unnecessary weight. He simplified the drivetrain. He tested materials that others had deemed too weak. The first prototype rolled off the line on September 23, 1940. It weighed 1,040 pounds, far over the limit, but it worked. The Army tested the Bantam prototype at Camp Holabird in Maryland. Officers watched as the little vehicle climbed hills that trucks couldn't scale, forded streams that would have drowned sedans, and carried loads that should have snapped its frame. It was faster than expected. It was tougher than predicted, but it was also too light to be stable at high speeds, and the engine overheated under sustained stress. Probst returned to Butler and redesigned the cooling system. He reinforced the axles. He recalculated the center of gravity. By November, the second prototype was ready. This time it passed every test. The Army was impressed, but they were not ready to commit. Willys Overland and Ford had submitted their own designs, both based heavily on Probst's original blueprint. The competition was political as much as technical. Bantam was small, underfunded, and unknown. Willys had influence. Ford had scale. Probst knew his design would be stolen. He also knew it would be used. And that, he told his wife in a letter dated December 4, 1940, was enough. By the time America entered the war, over 600,000 Jeeps had been ordered. Most bore the Willys nameplate. A few carried Ford's mark. None credited Probst. His blueprint had been copied, modified, and mass-produced without his name appearing in a single military report. He did not sue. He did not protest. He returned to his drafting table and continued working on transmissions, axles, and frames that would never make headlines. His colleagues said he seemed unbothered. His family said he seemed tired. In truth, Probst understood something that most engineers never grasp. The work mattered more than the recognition. The Jeep would carry wounded soldiers out of jungles, pull artillery through deserts, and ferry generals across liberated Europe. It would become a symbol of American resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity, and it would do so because one man refused to accept rejection. The Jeep that rolled into North Africa in 1942 was not the vehicle the army had requested. It was better. It had Probst's suspension, Probst's frame, and Probst's obsession with simplicity. Soldiers called it indestructible. Mechanics called it elegant. Historians would call it the most important vehicle of the war. But in the spring of 1940, it had been a rejected blueprint on a Philadelphia desk, dismissed by men who valued convention over innovation. Probst had proven them wrong in 49 days. The war would prove him right for the next 5 years. And in the decades that followed, as Jeeps rusted in fields and museums, the steel still carried the echo of his refusal to stop drawing. The town of Butler, Pennsylvania, had never built anything famous. It was a place of small factories, modest homes, and men who worked with their hands and rarely spoke of ambition. Bantam Car Company occupied a weathered brick building on the edge of town, where they assembled miniature cars for a market that no longer existed. By 1940, the company was drowning in debt. The workforce had been cut to 40 men. The president, Francis Fenn, spent his mornings negotiating with creditors and his afternoons staring at empty assembly lines. When the Army's request for a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle reached his desk, Fenn saw it as a lifeline or a final humiliation. Bantam had no engineering department, no military contracts, and no credibility, but they had desperation. And desperation, Fenn believed, could be weaponized. He called Detroit and asked for the best freelance engineer available. The man who answered was Karl Probst. Probst arrived on a Tuesday morning with a single suitcase and a roll of drafting paper. He was 46 years old, graying at the temples, and spoke in the clipped, precise manner of a man who had spent decades being ignored. Fenn showed him the Army's specifications. Probst read them twice, nodded and said, "This can be done." Fenn asked how long it would take. Probst said, "If you give me complete authority and no interruptions, I can have a working design in 5 days." Fenn agreed. Probst locked himself in a second-floor office overlooking the empty factory floor and began to draw. He worked through meals. He slept in a chair. He filled 40 pages with calculations, cross-sections, and material estimates. On the 5th day, he emerged with a complete blueprint. Fenn looked at it and said, "This doesn't look like any car I've ever seen." Probst replied, "It's not a car. It's a tool." The design was radical in its simplicity. Probst had eliminated everything that wasn't essential. There was no roof, no doors, no unnecessary curves. The body was a flat steel tub. The frame was a rigid rectangle. The suspension used leaf springs and solid axles, cheap, durable, and easy to repair. The engine was a modified Continental 4-cylinder, chosen not for power, but for reliability. Probst had calculated every weight distribution, every stress point, every potential failure. He had designed the vehicle to be assembled in sections, so that damaged parts could be replaced in the field without specialized tools. It was not elegant, it was not comfortable, but it was, in every measurable way, exactly what the Army had requested. Fenn approved the design immediately. The problem was building it. Bantam's machinists had never worked to military specifications. The welders had never reinforced frames for combat loads. The company had no testing equipment, no quality control systems, and no margin for error. Probst became foreman, inspector, and troubleshooter all at once. The first challenge was the frame. Probst had specified high-strength steel, but Bantam suppliers couldn't deliver it in time. He switched to a softer alloy and compensated by increasing the thickness of the crossbars. The second challenge was the drivetrain. Four-wheel drive systems were rare in 1940, and most were too heavy for the Jeep's weight limit. Probst designed a transfer case that split power between the front and rear axles using a simple lever mechanism. It was crude, but it worked. The third challenge was time. The Army had given them 49 days. Probst had already used 12, just finalizing the design. He divided the remaining time into shifts, 16 hours for fabrication, 4 hours for assembly, 4 hours for testing. He slept between shifts on a cot near the welding station. The factory ran 24 hours a day. Sparks lit the night, hammers rang until dawn, and slowly, piece by piece, the first Jeep began to take shape. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested to know how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. By mid-September, the prototype was nearly complete. Probst tested every component individually. He loaded the frame with sandbags to simulate combat weight. He ran the engine for 18 hours straight to check for overheating. He drove the vehicle up and down a steep hill behind the factory until the suspension groaned. Each test revealed a flaw. The steering was too stiff. The brakes locked under sudden pressure. The fuel tank leaked at high angles. Probst fixed each problem with a wrench, a blowtorch, and a pencil. He didn't write reports. He didn't ask for approval. He simply made the vehicle work. On September 21, 1940, 2 days before the Army's deadline, the first Bantam reconnaissance car was finished. It was painted olive drab. It had no serial number. It weighed 1,140 pounds, 540 pounds over the Army's limit. Probst knew it was too heavy. He also knew it was the best vehicle anyone had built in 49 days. He climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and drove it out of the factory. The engine hummed. The wheels turned. And for the first time in months, Francis Fenn allowed himself to hope. The prototype was loaded onto a flatbed truck and driven to Camp Holabird in Maryland, where Army engineers waited with stopwatches, scales, and skepticism. Probst did not accompany it. He returned to his drafting table and began sketching improvements for the second version. He knew the Army would find problems. He knew they would demand changes. And he knew that by the time they called, he would already have the solutions drawn. That was the difference between engineers who waited for orders and engineers who understood war. Probst had spent his entire career preparing for a moment that hadn't yet arrived. Now it had, and he was ready. The Jeep rolled off the truck at Camp Holabird on September 23, 1940. It would be tested, broken, rebuilt, and tested again. But it would never be rejected. The blueprint that had been dismissed in Detroit would become the foundation of the most reliable vehicle in military history. And the man who drew it would return to obscurity, carrying with him the quiet certainty that some things matter more than recognition. Camp Holabird sat on the outskirts of Baltimore, a sprawling testing ground where the U.S. Army evaluated every piece of equipment that might be sent to war. In the autumn of 1940, it was a place of mud, machinery, and men who trusted nothing they hadn't broken themselves. The testing officers were engineers, most of them older than Probst, all of them skeptical of civilian contractors who promised miracles. When the Bantam prototype arrived, they circled it like surgeons examining a questionable organ. It was smaller than they expected. It was lighter than the specifications allowed. And it looked, in the words of one major, like something a farmer would build in his barn. They decided to destroy it, not out of malice, but out of duty. If the vehicle couldn't survive their tests, it would kill soldiers in the field. So they drove it into ditches, flooded it in streams, loaded it with twice its rated capacity, and ran it at full speed over terrain that would have shattered a civilian truck. The Jeep did not break. It bent, it rattled, it leaked oil and coolant, but it did not break, and that changed everything. The first test was acceleration. The Jeep was required to reach 35 miles per hour on flat ground within 60 seconds. It reached 40 in 52. The second test was hill climbing. The vehicle had to ascend a 45-degree incline while carrying 3 men and equipment. It climbed without hesitation, the engine steady, the tires gripping loose gravel that should have caused it to slide backward. The third test was waterfording. The Jeep was driven into a shallow creek, then a deeper one, then a chest-deep pool where the engine should have flooded. It emerged each time with water pouring from the floorboards, but the motor still running. The officers took notes. They measured, photographed, and retested. They found problems. The steering was vague at high speeds, the brakes were inconsistent, and the body flexed under heavy loads, but none of the problems were fatal. The Jeep could be improved. More importantly, it could be built. That was the revelation. This was not a prototype that needed years of refinement. It was a production-ready design that could be handed to any competent factory and mass-produced within months. But there was a complication. Willys Overland Motors and Ford Motor Company had also submitted prototypes, both of them based on the Army's specifications, and both of them remarkably similar to Probst's design. The Willys vehicle was heavier, with a more powerful engine. The Ford version was simpler, with fewer parts and a lower production cost. The Army faced a decision: award the contract to Bantam, the small company that had delivered first, or split the order between Willys and Ford, the giants who could produce vehicles faster and cheaper. The decision was political. Bantam had proven the concept, but they lacked the infrastructure to build hundreds of thousands of Jeeps. Willys had factories, supply chains, and influence in Washington. Ford had even more. By December 1940, the Army had made its choice. Willys would receive the primary contract. Ford would manufacture under license, and Bantam would be sidelined, compensated with a small production run and nothing more. Probst's design would become the foundation of the Willys MB and the Ford GPW, the two models that would define the Jeep for the rest of the war. His name would not appear on either. Probst learned of the decision in a telegram sent to his boarding house in Butler. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. That evening, he returned to the Bantam factory and resumed work on the second prototype. He did not complain. He did not contact the press. He understood the logic of the decision, even if he disagreed with its fairness. The war effort required scale, and Bantam could not provide it. What mattered now was ensuring that the Jeep worked as intended, regardless of who built it. Over the next 6 months, Probst refined the design. He strengthened the frame to handle heavier loads. He improved the cooling system to prevent overheating in desert conditions. He redesigned the fuel tank to reduce leaks during steep climbs. Each modification was documented in technical drawings that he sent to both Willys and Ford. Neither company acknowledged his contributions. Both used his improvements, and by the summer of 1941, the first mass-produced Jeeps began rolling off assembly lines in Toledo and Detroit. The soldiers who drove those Jeeps never knew Karl Probst's name. They knew the vehicle as the Willys Jeep, and later simply as the Jeep, a term whose origin remains disputed to this day. Some claimed it came from the abbreviation GP for general purpose. Others said it was named after Eugene the Jeep, a cartoon character who could go anywhere and do anything. Probst didn't care about the name. He cared about whether the vehicle worked. And in the letters he received from mechanics stationed in North Africa, the Philippines, and Europe, the answer was always the same. It worked. It worked in sand that swallowed trucks. It worked in mud that trapped tanks. It worked in snow, rain, heat, and cold. It carried wounded men out of combat zones, towed artillery into firing positions, and served as mobile command posts for officers who needed to move quickly across broken terrain. It was not the most powerful vehicle in the war. It was not the most heavily armored, but it was the most reliable, and reliability, Probst had always believed, was the highest form of engineering. By 1943, over 400,000 jeeps had been produced. By the end of the war, the number would exceed 640,000. They were shipped to every theater of combat, used by every branch of the military, and adapted for roles that Probst had never imagined. Some were fitted with machine guns and used as light assault vehicles. Others were stripped down and used as ambulances. A few were modified with radios and used for reconnaissance deep behind enemy lines. The Jeep became so essential that General George Marshall would later call it one of the three tools that won the war, alongside the Douglas C-47 transport plane and the atomic bomb. Probst never commented on the comparison. He had moved on to other projects by then. Transmissions, axles, suspension systems for vehicles that would never be famous. But in the quiet hours of the evening, when the factory floor was empty and the welding torches had cooled, he would sometimes walk to the window and look out at the darkened streets of Butler. And he would remember the 49 days when everything he knew about steel, weight and motion had mattered more than recognition. The war had taken his design and made it immortal. That, he told himself, was enough. The first jeeps arrived in North Africa in the spring of 1942, crated and covered in cosmoline grease to protect them from the salt air of the Atlantic crossing. They were unloaded at the port of Oran by soldiers who had never seen a vehicle so small, so stripped down, so seemingly fragile. The British called them toys. The Americans called them jeeps and immediately put them to work. Within weeks, they were hauling ammunition across sand dunes, towing anti-tank guns into firing positions, and carrying wounded men back to field hospitals over roads that existed only as lines on a map. The mechanics who maintained them sent reports back to the States. The Jeep was tough, simple, and nearly impossible to kill. It broke down, of course. Everything broke down in the desert, but it could be repaired with basic tools and salvaged parts. A damaged radiator could be patched with wire and solder. A blown tire could be replaced in minutes. A cracked axle could be swapped out in an hour. The vehicle had been designed for this, not for comfort, not for speed, but for survival. And in the deserts of North Africa, survival was all that mattered. The German forces, equipped with heavier reconnaissance vehicles, watched the jeeps with a mixture of contempt and envy. The contempt came from the vehicle's appearance. It looked improvised, almost comical, like something assembled from scrap metal and hope. The envy came from its performance. The German Kubelwagen was lighter and more fuel-efficient, but it lacked four-wheel drive. The SDKFZ 222 armored car was faster and better armed, but it was too heavy to cross soft sand without getting stuck. The Jeep had no such limitations. It could go anywhere, carry anything, and keep moving long after other vehicles had surrendered to the terrain. Captured American Jeeps became prized possessions among German officers who repainted them in Wehrmacht grey and used them for their own reconnaissance missions. Some were even shipped back to Germany and studied by engineers who wanted to understand why the American design worked so well. They found no secret, no hidden innovation. The Jeep succeeded because it was simple, and simplicity in the chaos of war was the rarest form of sophistication. By the time the Allies landed in Italy, the Jeep had become indispensable. It climbed mountain roads that had been built for donkeys, forded rivers swollen with spring snowmelt, and carried supplies to artillery positions perched on ridgelines where no truck could reach. Soldiers modified them constantly. They welded armor plates to the front to protect against small arms fire. They mounted machine guns on improvised pedestals. They rigged camouflage netting over the frames and painted them in patterns that matched the Italian countryside. The Jeep became a canvas for battlefield ingenuity, A platform that could be adapted to any mission, any terrain, any desperate situation. And through it all, the basic design, Probst's design, remained unchanged. The frame was still a rigid rectangle, the suspension was still leaf springs and solid axles. The engine was still a simple four-cylinder. It worked because it had been designed to work, and it kept working because the men who used it understood that complexity was a luxury they couldn't afford. In the Pacific theater, the Jeep faced a different kind of war. The jungles of Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines were environments where vehicles died quickly, rusted by humidity, choked by mud, and swallowed by vegetation that grew back over roads within days. The Jeep survived because it could be disassembled and carried. When bridges were destroyed, soldiers took the Jeeps apart, carried the pieces across rivers on rafts, and reassembled them on the other side. When roads disappeared into swamps, they cut new paths through the jungle, winching the Jeeps over fallen trees and through streams thick with roots. The vehicle was not invincible. It could be damaged, it could be captured, and it could be lost, but it could not be stopped. That was the quality that Karl Probst had built into every weld, every bolt, every calculated angle. The Jeep was not designed to be perfect. It was designed to keep moving, and in the mud, heat, and chaos of the Pacific War, that was the only design philosophy that mattered. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. By 1944, over 500,000 Jeeps were in service worldwide. They were driven by American soldiers, British commandos, Soviet officers, Free French partisans, and Chinese nationalist forces. They carried generals and privates, weapons and medical supplies, radios and stretchers. They were used as ambulances, gun platforms, command posts, and supply trucks. They were photographed more than any other vehicle in the war, appearing in newsreels, propaganda posters, and soldiers' personal snapshots. The Jeep became the face of American industrial power, a symbol of practicality, resilience, and mass production. But the man who had designed it remained unknown. Karl Probst did not appear in newsreels. He did not give interviews. He did not attend military ceremonies or receive medals. He continued working at Bantam until the company went bankrupt in 1945, then moved to Studebaker, where he designed truck transmissions for the civilian market. He never sought recognition for the Jeep. He never wrote a memoir or claimed credit. And when asked years later why he had stayed silent, he said simply, "The work spoke for itself." The Jeep that crossed the Rhine in 1945 was the same vehicle that had been drawn in 5 days in the summer of 1940. It had been tested, refined, and mass-produced, but the core design, the frame, the suspension, the obsessive focus on simplicity remained Karl Probst's. It had carried soldiers through deserts, jungles, mountains, and cities. It had become a symbol of victory, a tool of liberation, and a testament to the idea that good engineering is not about innovation for its own sake, but about solving problems with clarity and precision. The war ended, the Jeeps kept moving, and somewhere in a modest house in Pennsylvania, Karl Probst returned to his drafting table and continued working on machines that would never be famous. He had drawn the blueprint that won the war. The steel still carried his refusal to accept rejection. The letters began arriving in early 1943. They came from mechanics in Italy, drivers in the Pacific, officers in North Africa, men who had never met Karl Probst, but who wanted to tell him that his vehicle had saved their lives. The letters were forwarded to Bantam's office in Butler, where a secretary collected them in a cardboard box and placed them on Probst's desk. He read them during lunch breaks, alone, without comment. One letter described a Jeep that had driven 40 miles through enemy territory with a broken axle, held together with rope and determination. Another described a vehicle that had been submerged in a river for 2 days, then pulled out, dried, and driven away. A third described a Jeep that had carried 12 wounded men at once, far beyond its rated capacity, because there was no other choice. Probst did not respond to the letters. He filed them carefully in a drawer and returned to work. But on some evenings, when the factory was quiet, he would take them out and read them again. They were proof that the design had worked, not in theory, not in testing, but in the chaos of war. And that, more than any recognition, was what mattered. The army never publicly credited Probst. The official history of the Jeep, written during the war, attributed its development to collaborative efforts between Bantam, Willys and Ford. Probst's name appeared in footnotes, if at all. The reason was partly political. Willys had powerful allies in Washington, and partly practical. The military preferred to emphasize institutional achievement over individual genius. It made for better propaganda. It made for simpler logistics. And it avoided uncomfortable questions about why a bankrupt car company had been sidelined in favor of larger manufacturers. Probst understood this. He had spent his career watching other men take credit for his work. He had learned not to expect fairness, only results, and the results spoke clearly. Over 640,000 Jeeps had been produced by the end of the war. They had served in every theater of combat, adapted to every mission, and survived conditions that had destroyed more sophisticated vehicles. The design had succeeded because it had been built on principles that Probst had spent a lifetime refining: simplicity, durability, and an obsessive attention to failure points. The Jeep worked because Probst had imagined every way it might break and then designed it not to. In the years after the war, the Jeep became a civilian icon. Willys marketed it as a farm vehicle, a hunting truck, and a rugged alternative to the sedans that dominated American roads. Advertisements featured the Jeep climbing mountains, crossing streams, and hauling loads that would have crushed ordinary cars. The company sold hundreds of thousands of units. Probst received no royalties. He had worked as a freelance contractor, paid a flat fee for his time in Butler, and signed away all rights to the design. It was a standard arrangement, common in the industry, and Probst never challenged it. He continued working as an engineer, moving between companies, designing components for trucks and tractors that were built, used, and forgotten. He retired in 1960 at the age of 66 and moved to a small house outside Detroit. He gardened. He read technical journals. He corresponded with former colleagues, and he never spoke publicly about the Jeep. When neighbors asked if he had worked in the auto industry, he said yes. When they asked what he had designed, he said trucks, mostly. He did not lie. He simply saw no reason to explain. The recognition came late, long after it could have mattered. In 1975, the Society of Automotive Engineers began researching the history of the Jeep's development. They found Probst's original drawings archived in a storage facility in Pennsylvania. They interviewed former Bantam employees who confirmed that Probst had designed the vehicle in 5 days and overseen its construction in 49. They contacted Willys and Ford, who admitted reluctantly that their designs had been based on Probst's prototype. In 1976, the Society awarded Probst a special citation for his contributions to automotive engineering. He was 82 years old. He attended the ceremony in a rented suit, accepted the plaque without a speech, and returned home the same day. A reporter asked him how it felt to finally receive recognition. Probst said, "The vehicle worked. That was always the recognition." He died 2 years later in 1978 in a hospital room overlooking a parking lot where several Jeeps were parked. His obituary was brief, noting his work at Bantam, Studebaker, and several smaller firms. It mentioned the Jeep in passing as one of many projects he had contributed to during his career. The Jeep that Karl Probst designed in 1940 is still in production today. It has been modified, updated, and redesigned dozens of times, but the core concept, a simple, durable, go-anywhere vehicle, remains unchanged. The frame is still a rigid rectangle. The suspension is still independent and adaptable. The philosophy is still the same: simplicity is strength. Over the decades, the Jeep has been used in conflicts across the globe: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, Afghanistan. It has been copied by manufacturers in Europe, Asia, and South America. It has become a symbol of rugged individualism, military might, and American engineering, and at the center of it all, invisible and uncredited for most of his life, was an engineer who refused to accept rejection. Probst never sought fame. He never demanded credit. He simply believed that if a problem could be solved, it should be solved correctly. And in the summer of 1940, given 5 days and a drafting table, he proved that belief could be forged into steel. The war ended. The factories kept building, and the blueprint that had been rejected in Detroit became the foundation of the most reliable vehicle ever built. The legacy of the Jeep extended far beyond the battlefields of World War II. When the war ended in 1945, the military found itself with hundreds of thousands of vehicles that were no longer needed for combat, but too valuable to scrap. Surplus Jeeps were sold to farmers, contractors, and adventurers who recognized their utility in peacetime. They became workhorses on ranches, hauling equipment across rough terrain that civilian trucks couldn't handle. They became explorers' vehicles, carrying geologists into remote deserts and foresters into roadless wilderness. They became, in a sense, the people's vehicle. Not in the utopian way that the Volkswagen had been imagined, but in the practical, unglamorous way that Probst had always intended. The Jeep succeeded because it was honest. It made no promises of comfort or luxury. It simply worked. And in post-war America, where millions of men had returned from overseas with a new appreciation for reliability over refinement, that honesty resonated deeply. Willys understood the opportunity. In 1945, they launched the CJ2A, the first civilian Jeep, marketed explicitly to farmers and outdoorsmen. The design was nearly identical to the military MB, with a few concessions to civilian life: a tailgate, side-mounted spare tire, and slightly more comfortable seats. The advertising emphasized durability and versatility. One ad showed a Jeep plowing a field, another showed it hauling firewood through snow, a third showed it crossing a shallow river, water splashing up around the wheels. The message was clear: this was not a car, it was a tool. And like all good tools, it could be used for purposes its designer never imagined. Farmers welded plows to the front and used them to clear land. Contractors mounted drills and used them for oil exploration. Police departments painted them white and used them for rural patrol. The Jeep adapted because its design allowed adaptation. Probst had built it to be modified, repaired, and rebuilt in the field. That same quality made it perfect for civilian life. A vehicle that could survive war could survive anything. The Jeep's influence spread internationally. The US military had distributed Jeeps to Allied forces during the war, and many of those vehicles remained overseas after 1945. In Europe, they were used to rebuild infrastructure, clear rubble, and transport supplies to regions still recovering from devastation. In Asia, they were used by colonial administrations, independence movements, and newly formed governments. In South America, they were used for mining, oil exploration, and agricultural development. The Jeep became a global symbol of American industrial power, but also of practicality and resilience. It was not a luxury item. It was not a status symbol. It was a machine that worked. And in the post-war world, where entire continents were rebuilding from ruins, that quality was more valuable than elegance or speed. The Jeep represented the possibility that simple, well-made things could endure. And that message resonated far beyond the borders of the United States. Meanwhile, Karl Probst continued working in obscurity. In the late 1940s, he joined Studebaker as a consultant, helping to redesign their truck chassis for better load distribution. He worked on suspension systems for agricultural equipment, transmissions for military vehicles, and axles for commercial trucks. None of these projects received public attention. None bore his name. Probst did not mind. He had never been motivated by recognition. He had been motivated by the problem itself, the challenge of making something work better, last longer, and require less maintenance. He approached every project the same way he had approached the Jeep, with a ruler, a pencil, and an absolute refusal to accept unnecessary complexity. His colleagues described him as quiet, meticulous, and occasionally stubborn. They said he would argue for hours over a single bolt placement or insist on testing a component until it failed, just to understand its limits. They said he hated shortcuts, distrusted trends, and believed that the best designs were the ones that disappeared into their function. They were right. In 1960, Probst retired. He was 66 years old and had spent 50 years in the automotive industry. He had designed components for hundreds of vehicles, most of which had been forgotten, and one that had changed the world. He never spoke about the imbalance. He moved to a small house in suburban Detroit, where he spent his mornings reading engineering journals and his afternoons tending a vegetable garden. He corresponded with former colleagues, offering advice on designs they were working on and critiquing technical papers they sent him. He was not bitter. He was not resentful. He simply continued thinking about how things worked and how they could work better. In the evenings, he would sit on his porch and watch the neighborhood. Occasionally, a Jeep would drive past, an old military model, rusted and repainted, or a newer civilian version, shiny and modified. Probst would watch it roll by, listen to the sound of its engine, and nod slightly. He never stopped the drivers to introduce himself. He never mentioned that he had designed the vehicle they were driving. He simply watched it work, and that for him was enough. The world moved on. New vehicles were designed, new wars were fought, new technologies emerged. The Jeep remained. It was updated, modernized, and reshaped dozens of times, but the core idea, a simple, durable, adaptable vehicle, never changed. It couldn't change. Probst had designed it so well that any deviation from his principles made the vehicle worse. Engineers at Willys and later at American Motors and Chrysler learned this through trial and error. When they added complexity, the Jeep became less reliable. When they prioritized comfort over durability, it lost its appeal. When they tried to make it something other than what it was, the market rejected it. The only designs that succeeded were the ones that honored Probst's original vision, simplicity, function, and an absolute commitment to making something that worked. The blueprint he had drawn in 5 days in 1940 remained the foundation of every Jeep built for the next 80 years. The war had ended. The factories had changed hands. The world had been rebuilt. But the steel still carried the echo of one man's refusal to accept rejection. Karl Probst died on October 10, 1978, at the age of 84. The obituary in the Detroit Free Press was 6 sentences long. It noted that he had worked as an automotive engineer for over 50 years, contributed to the development of the Jeep during World War II, and spent his retirement years in quiet study and correspondence. There was no funeral service. Per his instructions, his body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a private ceremony attended by family. His personal papers, decades of technical drawings, correspondence with colleagues, and notes on projects that had never been built, were donated to the Society of Automotive Engineers, where they were archived and largely forgotten. Probst had lived the way he had worked, quietly, precisely, and without expectation of recognition. He had solved the problem he was given, and then he had moved on. The world had not celebrated him. He had not asked it to. And in the end, the work remained. That, he had always believed, was the only legacy that mattered. The Jeep, meanwhile, continued to evolve. In the decades after Probst's death, it was produced by American Motors, then Chrysler, then Fiat Chrysler, and eventually Stellantis. Each company made changes, adding electronic systems, improving safety features, modernizing the interior. But the core design remained rooted in Probst's original blueprint. The frame was still based on his calculations. The suspension still followed his principles. The philosophy still echoed his belief that simplicity was strength. Engineers who worked on the Jeep in the 1980s and 1990s often referred to Probst's ratios when discussing load distribution, or the Bantam layout when describing the vehicle's structure. They did not always know who Probst was, but they understood that the original design had solved problems so effectively that deviation from it was almost always a mistake. The Jeep succeeded because Probst had designed it to succeed. And even as technology advanced, even as materials improved, even as the world moved toward electric motors and autonomous systems, the fundamental truth of his work remained. A well-designed vehicle does not need to be reinvented. It only needs to be refined. In 2002, the U.S. Army acknowledged Probst's contribution in a formal ceremony at the Pentagon. A plaque was unveiled, recognizing him as the principal designer of the Jeep and crediting his work with contributing to Allied victory in World War II and establishing a legacy of automotive excellence. The ceremony was attended by military historians, automotive engineers, and representatives from Chrysler. Probst's daughter, then in her 70s, accepted the honor on his behalf. She gave a brief speech in which she described her father as a man who cared more about whether something worked than whether anyone knew he had built it. She said he had never spoken about the Jeep at home, never displayed photographs of it, and never mentioned the controversy over credit. She said he had lived his life the way he had approached his work, with precision, humility, and an absolute refusal to waste time on things that didn't matter. The audience applauded. The plaque was installed in a corridor near the Pentagon's vehicle testing archives, and the story, for most people, ended there. But the Jeep did not end. It continued to be produced, sold, and used across the world. By 2020, over 20 million Jeeps had been manufactured, making it one of the most successful vehicle designs in history. It had been used in every major conflict since World War II. It had been featured in hundreds of films, driven by actors playing soldiers, adventurers, and rebels. It had become a cultural icon, a symbol of ruggedness and independence. And yet, the man who had designed it, who had drawn the blueprint in 5 days, refined it in 49, and then walked away without demanding credit, remained largely unknown outside of engineering circles. His name did not appear in advertisements. It did not appear in films. It did not appear in the Jeep's branding. It appeared only in archives, technical papers, and the memories of engineers who understood that great design is often invisible. Probst had designed the Jeep to disappear into its function, and in doing so, he had disappeared into his own creation. The final irony was that Probst's greatest contribution was not the Jeep itself, but the philosophy that had made it possible. He had proven that complexity was not synonymous with progress, that simplicity could be sophisticated, and that the best designs were the ones that solved problems without drawing attention to themselves. He had shown that an engineer's job was not to impress, but to serve, to make things that worked, that lasted, and that could be repaired by the people who used them. That philosophy had been lost in the decades after the war, as the automotive industry became obsessed with planned obsolescence, unnecessary features, and designs that prioritized profit over durability. But it was rediscovered slowly by engineers who studied Probst's work and understood what he had been trying to achieve. The Jeep endured because it had been designed to endure, and in an era of disposable products and engineered failure, that endurance became revolutionary all over again. In the end, the Jeep that Karl Probst designed in 1940 outlasted the war that made it famous. It outlasted the companies that built it. It outlasted the men who had rejected his blueprint and the men who had taken credit for it. It outlasted Probst himself, who died knowing that his work had succeeded, but never knowing how completely. The vehicle remained in production, adapted for new conflicts, new markets, and new generations. And somewhere in its steel frame, in the angles of its suspension, in the simplicity of its design, it still carried the echo of 5 days in Butler, Pennsylvania, when a rejected engineer sat at a drafting table and drew a vehicle that would change the world. The war ended, the factories kept building, and the blueprint that no one believed in became the foundation of the most reliable machine ever made. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and compelling cases. Thank you for following the story of Karl Probst. See you in the next video.